Have you ever stopped to think about who God really is? In an increasingly lost world, where the deception of the Antichrist is drawing near, many people are confused, without answers, and trapped in fear. But what if I told you that understanding who God truly is can give you strength, clarity, and protection in the face of what's to come? Today, you'll discover the truth that can transform your life before it's too late. Now, let's dive into the first topic, but before we start, just check if you're subscribed to the channel, because the upcoming videos will be part of a series that will help you improve your life. Let's get into the video. 1. Modern preacher's statement on the fear of God. Imagine you're listening to a pastor or preacher talking about God. He's explaining that the Bible teaches us to fear God, but he says something like this: "Don't worry, the fear of God is not like the fear of a lion or a dangerous snake. God is good and kind, we shouldn't fear him as if he were a monster." Now, if you stop to think about it, is that really true? Does the Bible actually teach that we don't need to fear God in a strong and real way, like we would if a lion were in front of us? Well, when you see a lion in the forest or a giant snake on the path, you would be really scared, right? That's because a lion has sharp claws, big teeth, and a lot of strength. It could do a lot of harm to you if you're not careful. The fear of something like that is natural because you know it's dangerous and has power over you. But the Bible teaches that, unlike a lion, God has much greater power, and he is far more powerful than anything or anyone on earth. Sometimes, we hear preachers saying that God is like Santa Claus, someone who only does good, is always nice, and will never harm us. But the truth is, God is much more than that. God is a powerful, just being who rules over all things in heaven and on earth. For example, imagine you're in a very high place, looking over a large city, and suddenly you realize you're facing someone much, much taller than you, maybe as tall as a 50-story building. This person has incredible power, something you can't even fully comprehend. That might make you feel a little scared, not because the person will harm you, but because you realize how small you are in comparison. This person has such great authority that you can only look at them with respect and admiration. And when we talk about God, the Bible says he is infinitely greater and more powerful than anything you could ever imagine. He created the world, the stars, the sun, and the moon. He has the power to do whatever he wants and to decide the destiny of every human being. The Bible tells us to fear God, not because he wants to scare us, but because he is the creator of everything, and his authority is so vast that we should look to him with deep respect, but also with the awareness that he can do whatever he pleases. So, when the Bible talks about fearing God, it's not saying he's a monster. It's saying that, just as you have respect, and maybe even a little fear, of someone much bigger and stronger than you, you should feel the same way when thinking about God, because he is greater than anything in the universe. And this fear is not about running away, but about recognizing how great and amazing he is. It's a healthy fear, one that comes from knowing that he is much more than anything or anyone you've ever encountered. Have you ever stopped to think about what it truly means to fear God? Is it just about respect, or is there something much deeper that modern preachers are overlooking? While many soften the idea of God's power and authority, the Bible reveals an overwhelming truth: God is infinitely greater and more powerful than we can imagine. In the e-book, you will find biblical prophecies and their connections to the rise of technological control, practical strategies to preserve your freedom in a digital world, inspiring stories of people who chose to fight for a better future. Understanding what's truly at stake has never been more urgent. Global changes directly impact your life. The time to prepare is now. Don't wait until it's too late. Be part of the change. Take advantage of an exclusive 24-hour discount. Don't miss this chance to access crucial insights at a special price. Click the link now and secure your copy. 2. The fear of God in the Scriptures and the threat of the Antichrist. The Bible describes the fear of God in a deep and multifaceted way. Throughout the Scriptures, the fear of God is not just a superficial respect or simple reverence. It involves a deep recognition of God's greatness, holiness, and absolute authority. This kind of fear is often described as the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs chapter 9 verse 10, and as a means of protecting us from the temptations and deceptions that could lead us away from God. This fear is tied to the understanding that God is infinitely greater than us, with a power that transcends everything we know. He is not just a kind and loving being, but also a just judge who has authority over all of creation. The fear of God is related to the idea that, before Him, we are small and limited, and our natural response should be one of humility, reverence, and worship. The Bible makes it clear that while God is full of grace and mercy, He is also a consuming fire, Hebrews chapter 12 verse 29, and His justice demands that evil be judged. The fear of God as protection against deception. This deep fear of God is crucial for our spiritual life, as it protects us from being deceived by ideologies or figures that seek to replace God. When we have the true fear of God, we won't be misled by false promises of power or salvation. This is one of the reasons the Antichrist, a figure described in the book of Revelation and various other parts of the Bible, poses a great spiritual threat. The Antichrist, according to biblical prophecy, will be a charismatic and powerful figure who will emerge in the last days, with the goal of diverting people from true worship of God. He will come with signs and wonders, trying to deceive even the elect, Matthew chapter 24 verse 24, offering easy solutions to the world's complex problems. His mission will be to create a system where he himself will position himself as the supreme leader, demanding worship and loyalty from all. The Antichrist will not initially present himself as a malevolent and destructive being. On the contrary, he will be an attractive figure who seduces many with promises of peace, prosperity, and quick solutions to the world's conflicts. He will use his intelligence and power to manipulate the masses and create a global system that seems like a utopia, but will, in reality, be destined for destruction. The way the Antichrist will deceive people will be particularly effective because many will have lost the true fear of God. When people do not have a clear understanding of God's authority and holiness, they are more susceptible to follow any leader offering answers that seem appealing. The Antichrist will infiltrate the world's ideas and values, distorting the biblical truth and making worship of God appear outdated or even irrelevant. The Antichrist and the distortion of the fear of God. One of the Antichrist's most powerful tactics will be to manipulate the concept of fear to divert people from God. Instead of teaching them to fear God with reverence, he will attempt to instill in them a false fear, a fear of chaos, a fear of the future, a fear of suffering, or of scarcity, that will make them run to him as the solution. This fear generated by the Antichrist will be a fear that leads to control, submission, and worship of something or someone other than God. Moreover, the Antichrist will seek to distort the true understanding of God's power, presenting a false power and false authority that may appear more attractive to people seeking comfort, security, and immediate prosperity. He may present himself as someone who has the power to solve all global problems, while God, the creator of all things, will be marginalized. The Antichrist's strategy is to undermine the genuine fear of God by making people feel more drawn to a power that seems more practical or accessible than God's power. This deception is clearly described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 9 to 12, where Paul speaks of the man of sin, a reference to the Antichrist, who, by the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. The Antichrist will use false miracles, convincing lies, and emotional manipulation to deceive people's hearts, causing them to trade the true fear of God for a false hope and faith in something that is nothing more than an illusion. The lack of fear of God as an open door to deception. When people lose the true fear of God, they become more vulnerable to follow any leadership that seems to offer easy solutions, even if those solutions contradict what the Bible teaches. This happens because the loss of the fear of God leads to a failure in perceiving His holiness, authority, and justice. As a result, people begin to trust their own opinions, ideas, and solutions, ignoring the principles and truths God has revealed. The Antichrist will take advantage of this spiritual weakness, knowing that those who lack a solid foundation in the fear of God will be easily manipulated. The Antichrist will try to convince people that he is the Savior they have been waiting for, offering them a false peace and a false sense of security. But the truth is, when someone follows the Antichrist, they are, in fact, heading for destruction because he stands completely opposed to God. The true fear of God, characterized by a deep reverence for His holiness and power, is what keeps us firm in our faith, even in the face of leaders and influences that try to divert us from the true path. This fear gives us discernment to perceive the lies and seductions of the world and keeps us anchored in the truth of God. The Antichrist and the loss of the fear of divine judgment. In addition to trying to divert people from the fear of God, the Antichrist will also try to undermine the understanding of the consequences of God's judgment. When people lose the fear of divine judgment, the understanding that there will be a final judgment where God will make justice of all deeds, they become more susceptible to follow any earthly power offering immediate comfort, without realizing that this path leads to eternal condemnation. The Antichrist will work to conceal the reality of God's judgment, making people ignore or even reject the idea that they need to repent and live according to God's will. 3. The fear of God as something positive and protective. Imagine you're walking through a dense, mysterious forest. The sun is setting, and the light grows dimmer with each passing moment. In the distance, you hear the sound of something moving among the trees. Your heart starts to race. You feel that chill in your stomach, a fear that sharpens your senses and makes you more alert. But as you look closer, you realize it's not a wild beast or something dangerous. Instead, it's the guardian of the forest, a wise figure who has lived there for ages, knowing every path, danger, and secret of the woods. This guardian, with their wisdom and authority, is someone to be feared, but in a different way. It's not the kind of fear that paralyzes or makes you run away. It's the kind of fear that teaches you to be cautious, to listen, and to learn from their guidance. When you understand that this guardian has the power to protect and guide you, you begin to feel a deep respect for them, a respect born from the realization that they mean you well but demand your attention to avoid pitfalls and dangers. This story helps us understand the fear of God. It's not the fear of an enemy seeking to destroy us, but the reverence for a supreme being who knows every path of life, who guides us, and at the same time requires our obedience and respect. The Bible portrays God as this guardian of life, someone who not only loves us but also has the authority to judge and correct us when necessary. In Proverbs, chapter 9, verse 10, we learn that, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." This fear is not about irrational dread but a profound understanding of who God is, the Creator, the Judge, and our Savior. When we fear God rightly, we understand His greatness and holiness. It's not a fear that pushes us away but one that draws us closer, teaching us to live according to His principles and understand His will for our lives. This kind of fear is also protective. It shields us from the traps of sin, poor decisions, and paths that lead us away from God. God, as our protector, warns us of dangers, much like that forest guardian showing us the safe trails. In Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 29, God is described as a consuming fire. This doesn't mean He wants to destroy us but rather that His presence is so pure, so holy, that it refines and protects us from anything harmful that could separate us from Him. Think about this: when someone truly loves another, they don't just want their immediate comfort but their ultimate good, even if it means correction or discipline. The fear of God reflects this profound love, which seeks to free us from errors and lies that entangle us. God doesn't call us to fear destruction but to respect His authority and understand that without Him, we cannot live fully. What God desires from us is reverent fear, like the respect one feels for a great leader or mentor. Like that forest guardian, who may seem a little intimidating but is also someone who, when followed, leads us along the right path. The true fear of God is one that moves us to trust in His wisdom, respect His instructions, and seek His help in times of difficulty. It's not a fear that paralyzes but a fear that draws us closer to Him. 4. The difference between fear and reverence. When we talk about the fear of God, many people confuse its meaning with something that is limited to a form of respect or reverence. While respect is part of the fear of God, the Bible teaches that fear goes far beyond mere deference. The fear of God involves a deep awareness of His greatness, power, and authority. It is not just an act of respect, but a sincere response to understanding God's holiness and judgment. The fear of God according to the Bible. The word used in the Bible to describe the fear of God is the Greek word phobos, which appears in passages such as Matthew chapter 10, verse 28 and Luke chapter 12, verse 5. The term phobos has a range of meanings that goes beyond simple reverence. It includes a fear that also involves a sense of awe or terror in the face of God's greatness and power. When Jesus speaks in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, He teaches us not to fear those who can destroy the body, but to fear God, who has the power to destroy both body and soul in hell. This kind of fear is not irrational terror, but an understanding of God's authority and final judgment. The fear Jesus speaks of here is not the fear of being punished for every little mistake, but the recognition that God is sovereign over all things, and that before Him, all our actions have eternal consequences. In other words, the fear of God is the response of someone who understands that we cannot play with God's laws or ignore His will, because He is the supreme judge, the one who has power over life and death. The fear and authority of God. God is not only a good being who offers blessings and mercy. He is also just and holy, and His holiness demands respect and reverence. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29, God is described as a consuming fire. This does not mean He is a cruel or vengeful God, but rather that His purity and justice are so perfect and powerful that nothing impure or wrong can remain in His presence. The consuming fire symbolizes the purity of His character and the necessity that, before His presence, we must be purified and refined. When we understand God's authority, we begin to fear Him in a wise and just way. We do not fear God as we would fear an enemy who wants to harm us, but we fear Him as someone who, though full of mercy, is also just and impartial in His judgments. This type of fear leads us to deep humility, as we recognize our weakness and our need to live according to His will. The danger of minimizing the fear of God. In today's world, the concept of the fear of God is often softened, reduced to something like simple respect or reverence. While this is an important part of what it means to fear God, it is important to recognize that the Bible does not teach us to only have a reverent attitude toward God. Reverence is important, but without understanding His authority and power, we risk having a distorted view of God. When preachers or leaders minimize the concept of the fear of God, replacing it with terms like respect or veneration, they may inadvertently dilute the seriousness of the biblical message about God's judgment. If the fear of God is reduced to mere respect, people may begin to neglect the seriousness of His word and His final judgment. This can result in a lack of spiritual discernment, where people fail to perceive the gravity of sin or rebellion against God. The fear of God as the beginning of wisdom. The Bible, however, makes it clear that the fear of God is not something negative, but something that protects us and leads us to true wisdom. In Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, the word says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." This teaches us that true understanding of who God is begins with the recognition of His authority and holiness. True wisdom does not come from trusting our own understanding, but from recognizing God as the foundation of all wisdom and truth. This fear guides us to a life of obedience and purity, because when we fear God, we know that our actions have consequences, not only in this life but also in eternity. The fear of God leads us to avoid sin, to seek justice, and to live according to His commandments. It teaches us to make decisions based on reverence for His word and the understanding that He is the final judge of all our actions. The fear of God is necessary for a fulfilled life. When we fear God in the right way, our choices and actions begin to reflect the desire to live according to His will. The fear of God helps us to have a healthy perspective on sin and God's holiness, reminding us that we are to be holy as He is holy. This kind of fear keeps us alert and helps us avoid the deceptions that can lead us astray from the path of truth. Moreover, the fear of God also protects us from the deceptions of the world and helps us discern the false ideas and philosophies that surround us. Often, the world offers alternative paths and easy solutions, but the fear of God teaches us to evaluate these proposals in light of His truth, ensuring we do not follow a path that leads to destruction. In summary, the fear of God is more than just simple reverence. It is the response to the understanding that God is sovereign, just, and merciful, and that our actions before Him have great significance. This fear is essential for a wise life, as it teaches us to live justly, to seek His will, and to depend on His grace to live in holiness. If this content helped you understand more about the fear of God, leave a like. This helps YouTube show my videos to new people and also encourages me to continue bringing reflections that touch the heart. Let's move on to the next topic. 5. The fear of God as consciousness of His power and authority. Once upon a time, in a small village atop a mountain, the people lived simple and peaceful lives. Everyone knew the legend of the guardian of the mountain, a mythical creature who ruled the surrounding forests and maintained the balance of nature. Although the guardian never appeared directly, his presence was felt in every tree, every river, and even in the behavior of the animals. The villagers deeply respected this mysterious figure because they knew that, while the guardian was just, he also had immense power, something that could not be ignored. Even when the guardian was not around, everyone knew he was watching, and their actions had consequences. One day, a young man from the village, wanting to prove his courage, decided to challenge the guardian and enter the forbidden forest. He thought that if he was careful, he could remain unnoticed. But as soon as he stepped into the forest, he quickly sensed something strange, a constant feeling of presence, a power that surrounded him, as if the forest itself were watching his every move. As the young man ventured deeper into the guardian's territory, something unexpected happened. A loud, imposing sound reverberated through the trees, and a giant shadow stretched out in front of him. The guardian's voice echoed, "You know where you are, but you do not understand the power that governs me. What you fear is not only what I can do, but what you must understand about my domain." Terrified, the young man hurried back to the village, now understanding for the first time the true meaning of respect and fear. He realized that the guardian was not just a legend, but a real authority who governed everything around him, and by approaching his domain, he had challenged something far greater than himself. This story can help us understand the fear of God. Often, we think of God only as a being who loves and blesses us, but He is also a sovereign Lord, with incomparable power and authority. The Bible teaches us that, beyond His love, God is the supreme judge over all of creation. This deep understanding of divine authority is an essential part of the fear of God. The fear of God in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, Jesus teaches us, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear Him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." This passage is a clear reminder that, while humans may take our physical lives, God has authority over the eternal destiny of our souls. Here, Jesus teaches us that, in a world full of dangers and threats, our greatest concern should be with God, who has power not only over the present but over our eternity. The fear of God, in its essence, is a deep recognition of His sovereign authority over everything that exists. When we understand that He has the power to give and take life, and that our souls are in His hands, this leads us to a posture of humility and obedience. It is not a fear of terror or flight, but a reverence that reminds us that God is above all and everyone, and His decisions have eternal consequences. God's power over all things and everyone. Just as the young man from the village realized that there was something far greater and more powerful than himself at work in the forest, the fear of God makes us recognize that nothing in our lives is beyond the reach of His power. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29, we read that, "Our God is a consuming fire." This description of God emphasizes His destructive and purifying power. Although He is loving and merciful, His holiness is something that must be feared for its purity and intensity. God is not just a distant, indifferent being. He is active and present, governing everything with wisdom and justice. When we understand the fear of God, we also understand that He is not someone to be manipulated or ignored. We cannot live as if there are no consequences for our actions, because God is not to be mocked, Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. His authority is unquestionable, and all things are made according to His will. When we understand this, we become more responsible in our walk with Him, knowing that our choices have eternal impact. The fear of God protects and guards us. To fear God does not mean to be consumed by a paralyzing fear, but by a healthy awareness of His authority, which guides us to live according to His will. The fear of God helps us avoid sin and live in obedience because we know that He is the supreme judge, and our actions have weight before Him. This kind of fear also protects us from deception, because when we recognize God's power, we know we cannot follow any path that leads us away from His will. God, in His goodness, gives us this awareness of His power to guide and protect us. The fear of God prevents us from making hasty or selfish decisions that could lead us to destruction. Instead, it drives us to live with wisdom and discernment, knowing that God is in control of everything and that our purpose is to live to glorify Him in every action we take. 6. God is not like a Santa Claus, He is a consuming fire and the true authority in judgment. Many times, people imagine God only as a kind and benevolent figure, like a spiritual Santa Claus, ready to bestow blessings, love, and forgiveness without demanding much from us. This superficial understanding of God can create a false sense that we don't need to worry about the seriousness of His holiness and judgment. But the Bible presents God in a completely different way. He is described as a consuming fire, someone whose authority and holiness cannot be ignored. God's fire is associated with His justice and purity, and this truth must be feared by all. However, beyond God being a consuming fire, there is also a figure that arises to minimize the fear of God and deceive the world, offering a false peace. This is the Antichrist, whose mission will be to completely oppose God and establish a false authority that will attract those who reject God's true holiness. The Antichrist will emerge, according to Scripture, as a charismatic and powerful leader, but one who will represent everything that is contrary to the purity and power of the true God. The Antichrist and false authority. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, the Apostle Paul speaks about the coming of the man of lawlessness, who will be the Antichrist, and describes how he will exalt himself above all that is considered divine or worthy of worship. The Antichrist will seek to take the place of God, proclaiming himself as an absolute authority over all things. He will attempt to destroy the legitimate fear of God, offering a distorted version of reality in which God is treated only as a distant being with no real power over human actions. His agenda will be to lead people into rebellion against God's true authority, offering a false sense of security and peace. The Antichrist will position himself as an attractive alternative to the true fear of God. In Revelation chapter 13, we read that the Antichrist and the false prophet will deceive the nations with miracles and signs, causing everyone to worship the beast and accept his authority as if it were divine. He will promote an ideology of human self-exaltation, where obedience to God and recognition of His holiness are replaced by a false system of worship that leads people away from the true God. God as a consuming fire, judge and supreme authority. In contrast, God is the true judge, and His power and holiness cannot be manipulated or contested. He is the consuming fire that purifies and destroys evil. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29, we are reminded that our God is a consuming fire, which means that His holiness and justice demand that sin be confronted and purified. This fire is not purposeless destruction but a means of purification and renewal. God is the one who, in His sovereignty, establishes the standards of justice and holiness, and no one, not even the Antichrist, can challenge them without facing the consequences. When the Antichrist tries to establish his false authority, God, as the supreme judge, will intervene with great power. The Bible teaches us that the arrival of the Antichrist will be marked by signs and wonders, but also by a great tribulation and a final judgment, in which the Antichrist will be defeated. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 20, we see that the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet will be thrown alive into the lake of fire. This is the end of the Antichrist, the complete defeat of all evil before the judgment of God. The consuming fire of God as a warning. The fear of God should remind us that He is much more than a spiritual Santa Claus. God is a consuming fire that judges with justice, and no one can escape His authority. When the Antichrist arises, he will try to convince the world to ignore this divine power, offering a false peace and security. But those who maintain the true fear of God will understand that this peace is illusory. True peace only comes from submission to the living God, who is just, holy, and sovereign. This healthy fear keeps us from being deceived by the Antichrist, for we recognize that no human or demonic authority can challenge the authority of God without facing the consequences of His righteous judgment. The Antichrist, who will try to be worshipped as a divine figure, will ultimately be defeated by the power of God's consuming fire, which purifies and brings justice. When we understand that God is this supreme authority, it leads us to live in reverence and obedience to His commandments, knowing that, unlike the Antichrist, He is worthy of our worship and respect. The need for the fear of God in the last days. In the last days, when the Antichrist rises and tries to deceive the nations, it will be even more crucial for believers to maintain a healthy fear of God, which keeps us firm in His truth. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 7, the angel proclaims, "Fear God and give Him glory, because the hour of His judgment has come." This is the call for all who fear God to remain faithful, even in the face of the Antichrist's seductions and the difficult times ahead. The fear of God is not only a response to His authority but also a spiritual protection against the lies and deceptions the Antichrist will bring. 7. The Bible teaches that it is fearful to fall into the hands of the living God, the Antichrist, and false security. In contemporary society, many have a deluded view of God, seeing Him only as a loving being who will never exercise His judgment with severity. However, the Bible is clear: falling into the hands of the living God is something to be feared, for He is the just and sovereign judge. The Apostle Paul writes in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." This verse reminds us that God's judgment is a serious reality, and His holiness demands reverence. However, the Antichrist, in his attempt to deceive the world, will try to make people ignore this fear and act as if God's judgment is distant or irrelevant. He will create a false sense of security, convincing people that there is no reason to fear God's judgment, but only to follow His authority and promises. The fear of God and the final judgment. The fear of God is not an irrational fear but a genuine reverence for God's greatness and holiness. Hebrews 10 verse 31 reminds us that God is alive and, therefore, His actions are dynamic and real. He is not a distant or absent God but a judge who will weigh all human actions with justice. God's judgment will be impartial, and everyone will have to appear before Him, as it says in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." However, the Antichrist will use deceit to divert people's attention away from this final judgment. He will make people believe that God's judgment can be avoided or that there is no real punishment for sin. He will promote a system where divine laws and standards will be subverted, creating an environment where rebellion against God will be considered acceptable. In 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 3, Paul warns us about the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, who will rise to deceive those who do not have the true fear of God. The false authority of the Antichrist and the loss of fear. The Antichrist, in his coming, will seek to present himself as an absolute authority, replacing the fear of God with a false system of worship and subordination. He will exalt himself above God, as described in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4, declaring that he is worthy of worship and deceitfully proclaiming himself as if he were a god. He will promote an ideology of human self-exaltation and rejection of God's sovereignty, deceiving those who do not recognize the coming judgment. In Revelation 13, we read about the rise of the Antichrist, who will perform great signs and wonders to convince people to worship him and follow his authority. He will establish a system of control where worship of God will be replaced with worship of a human figure, and any opposition to this system will be dealt with harshly. This is in direct contrast to the fear of God, which reminds us of the seriousness of his words and the reality of his judgment. The Antichrist will try to deceive people by offering a false peace, but the scriptures warn us about the end of the Antichrist and the ultimate defeat of his evil system. In Revelation 19 verse 20, we see that the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet will be thrown into the lake of fire, the place of eternal condemnation. The system the Antichrist tries to establish will be destroyed by God's justice. God's judgment, the consuming fire. God, as the supreme judge, is described in Hebrews 12 verse 29 as a consuming fire. This fire symbolizes the purity of his holiness and the need to purify evil. However, the Antichrist tries to manipulate people's perception of God's judgment, offering false security, making people think that by following him, they will escape any consequences. But the truth is that, no matter how much the Antichrist tries to deceive, God's judgment is inevitable. The system he will build will be fleeting and vulnerable, and the truth that remains is that no one can escape God's judgment. The Bible warns that everyone will have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, where their actions will be judged according to God's standards of holiness and justice. The need for the fear of God in the last days. In the last days, when the Antichrist rises with great power and deception, it will be even more crucial for believers to maintain the true fear of God. The Antichrist will try to divert people's attention from their true responsibility before God, making them conform to their own desires and to his authority, but God's final judgment cannot be avoided. The fear of God prepares us to recognize the seriousness of spiritual life and the need for submission to God, regardless of the lies and seductions of the Antichrist. In Revelation 14 verse 7, the angel proclaims, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come." This is the call for all who fear God to remain faithful, even in the face of the pressure to follow the Antichrist and his evil system. The fear of God preserves us from falling into the traps of deception and keeps us firm in the truth. 8. The Bible teaches that it is fearful to fall into the hands of the living God, the Antichrist and false security. In contemporary society, many have a deluded view of God, seeing him only as a loving being who will never exercise his judgment with severity. However, the Bible is clear, falling into the hands of the living God is something to be feared, for he is the just and sovereign judge. The Apostle Paul writes in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." This verse reminds us that God's judgment is a serious reality, and his holiness demands reverence. However, the Antichrist, in his attempt to deceive the world, will try to make people ignore this fear and act as if God's judgment is distant or irrelevant. He will create a false sense of security, convincing people that there is no reason to fear God's judgment, but only to follow his authority and promises. The fear of God and the final judgment. The fear of God is not an irrational fear but a genuine reverence for God's greatness and holiness. Hebrews 10 verse 31 reminds us that God is alive and, therefore, his actions are dynamic and real. He is not a distant or absent God but a judge who will weigh all human actions with justice. God's judgment will be impartial, and everyone will have to appear before him, as it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." However, the Antichrist will use deceit to divert people's attention away from this final judgment. He will make people believe that God's judgment can be avoided or that there is no real punishment for sin. He will promote a system where divine laws and standards will be subverted, creating an environment where rebellion against God will be considered acceptable. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, Paul warns us about the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, who will rise to deceive those who do not have the true fear of God. The false authority of the Antichrist and the loss of fear. The Antichrist, in his coming, will seek to present himself as an absolute authority, replacing the fear of God with a false system of worship and subordination. He will exalt himself above God, as described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, declaring that he is worthy of worship and deceitfully proclaiming himself as if he were a god. He will promote an ideology of human self-exaltation and rejection of God's sovereignty, deceiving those who do not recognize the coming judgment. In Revelation chapter 13, we read about the rise of the Antichrist, who will perform great signs and wonders to convince people to worship him and follow his authority. He will establish a system of control where worship of God will be replaced with worship of a human figure, and any opposition to this system will be dealt with harshly. This is in direct contrast to the fear of God, which reminds us of the seriousness of his words and the reality of his judgment. The Antichrist will try to deceive people by offering a false peace, but the scriptures warn us about the end of the Antichrist and the ultimate defeat of his evil system. In Revelation 19 verse 20, we see that the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet will be thrown into the lake of fire, the place of eternal condemnation. The system the Antichrist tries to establish will be destroyed by God's justice. God's judgment, the consuming fire. God, as the supreme judge, is described in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29 as a consuming fire. This fire symbolizes the purity of his holiness and the need to purify evil. However, the Antichrist tries to manipulate people's perception of God's judgment, offering false security, making people think that by following him, they will escape any consequences. But the truth is that, no matter how much the Antichrist tries to deceive, God's judgment is inevitable. The system he will build will be fleeting and vulnerable, and the truth that remains is that no one can escape God's judgment. The Bible warns that everyone will have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, where their actions will be judged according to God's standards of holiness and justice. The need for the fear of God in the last days. In the last days, when the Antichrist rises with great power and deception, it will be even more crucial for believers to maintain the true fear of God. The Antichrist will try to divert people's attention from their true responsibility before God, making them conform to their own desires and to his authority, but God's final judgment cannot be avoided. The fear of God prepares us to recognize the seriousness of spiritual life and the need for submission to God, regardless of the lies and seductions of the Antichrist. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 7, the angel proclaims, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come." This is the call for all who fear God to remain faithful, even in the face of the pressure to follow the Antichrist and his evil system. The fear of God preserves us from falling into the traps of deception and keeps us firm in the truth. 9. God is incomprehensibly superior to human beings, and our ability to understand his nature is limited. Once upon a time, in a small village, there was a young man named John who loved learning about the world around him. He would spend hours studying nature, observing the sky, and trying to understand the stars. John had a burning desire to comprehend everything. He believed that if he looked closely enough at things, he could uncover all the secrets of the universe. One day, he heard of a wise elder who lived atop a mountain, someone who supposedly knew everything there was to know about life and the cosmos. Determined to learn everything from the sage, John began a long journey up the mountain, determined to understand all that the sage knew. After days of walking, John finally reached the top of the mountain and found the elder sitting on a large rock. He was eager and asked, without wasting any time, "Master, please teach me everything you know. I want to understand the universe, everything there is to know. I want to understand how everything works, how everything was made, and why things happen." The sage looked at John with a calm smile and responded, "John, you are asking to understand something that is beyond your capacity. What you seek cannot be fully comprehended by the human mind. The beauty of the universe lies in the fact that there are mysteries beyond our understanding. And often, we must learn to accept that we cannot understand everything." John was surprised and replied, "But I thought that if I knew enough, I could understand everything. Why are there things that are impossible to comprehend?" The sage answered, "Because our mind, however incredible it may be, has limits. Some mysteries are so deep that our understanding cannot reach them. And this is not a mistake, John. It is the beauty of creation. This fictional encounter illustrates a great spiritual truth that we often overlook: our ability to understand the fullness of God is deeply limited. God, in his infinite and incomprehensible nature, is beyond our full comprehension. As human beings, we are limited by time, matter, and our experience. Even the greatest and brightest theologians and philosophers in history acknowledge that while we may know God in meaningful ways, we will never fully understand who he is. God and his infinite superiority. In Isaiah 55 verses 8-9, God tells us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This verse highlights the absolute difference between God's wisdom and understanding and our limited understanding. God's wisdom is beyond our comprehension. He sees everything in a way we will never be able to see. He knows the beginning and the end of all things, and we, with our finite minds, cannot grasp the extent of his wisdom. This does not mean that we cannot know God or that he is inaccessible, but rather that there are aspects of his nature that are beyond our ability to fully understand. The infinite nature of God. God is infinitely wise, powerful, and holy. His justice and mercy are in perfect balance, but often we cannot see or understand how this works in specific situations. We often see suffering and question why he allows things that seem unjust to us. We may try to understand, but our limited view does not allow us to see the whole picture, much like someone trying to view a giant painting through a small piece of glass. God, in his greatness, sees the entirety, while we see only fragments. When we try to understand God completely with our limited minds, we are like a fish trying to understand the vastness of the ocean. The fish lives in the ocean, but it cannot comprehend the vastness and mysteries of the deep. So too are we. Our experience of God is like a glimpse of the fullness of his majesty, and there will always be things that remain mysterious to us. Accepting God's mysteries. This understanding that God is incomprehensibly superior to us should lead us to humility. Rather than trying to understand everything about God, we should learn to trust in him. Even if we don't understand all the reasons for the things that happen, we can trust in his wisdom and justice. This is the fear of God, recognizing his sovereignty and greatness, and understanding that no matter how much we seek answers, there are things we will never fully understand. In Romans 11 verses 33-34, Paul exclaims, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor?" This reminds us that God is not only incomprehensible, but also indescribable. His wisdom transcends our understanding, and his action in the world is often beyond our sight. The meaning for our lives. Understanding that God is beyond our ability to fully comprehend calls us to an attitude of humility and trust. When we face difficulties or moments we cannot understand, we can rely on the certainty that God is in control. We don't need to have all the answers. True fear of God is recognizing him as the supreme being, whose nature we cannot fully understand, but in whom we can fully trust. This knowledge should also make us more grateful for what God has already revealed about himself, through nature, the scriptures, and his action in our lives. We can know God, but always with the humility to recognize that there is a vast mystery and beauty in his nature that we will never fully comprehend. Well, we have reached the end of the video, but before you go, I've linked a related video above that I believe will help you even more with your struggles. Thank you for watching until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep receiving content. See you in the next video.